in this example, I want to take a look at a simple Node.js project where we're querying DynamoDB local instance. So what I want to do is on my desktop, I'm going to create a new directory that's going to implement both scan and query. So just how we would look at our data through code. So I'm going to call this Node Dynamo scan and query. And then I'm going to change my working directory. I'm going to go ahead and initialize this project as an npm project. So I'm going to do an npm init. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and open up this folder in Visual Studio Code first. Okay, and then instead of working from my terminal window, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work from Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to open up a terminal in Visual Studio Code that's in the same directory, so kind of the same thing here. And then I'm going to do my npm init here inside of Visual Studio Code. There is no difference. I just kind of like to work always from the same spot. So I'm going to do an npm init. It's asking me what my package name is. That's fine. All of it's fine. Okay, so I'm just going to hit yes, and that'll create my package.json file. And then for scan and query, I'm going to need a couple of SDK libraries. I don't need the full SDK, but I do need some SDK library. So I'm going to do an npm install of the aws-sdk / client-dynamodb. Okay, so that's the first one that I'm going to need. And then the second one that I'm going to need is essentially the same thing, but it's going to be the util-dynamodb. And I was debating whether it's util or utils, and it's util. Okay, so those are the two packages that I've required. So here's my node modules folder. You can see here's the AWS SDK. It has the DynamoDB client. Okay, and then the util DynamoDB. It has additional stuff as well because those individual packages have some dependencies, but that's the idea. Okay, since I'm going to be importing a couple of libraries, I have to make this a module, JavaScript module file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new text file. I'm going to save this as index.mjs. Okay, the MJS file extension is a node module file, and that allows me to have those node modules. Okay, so I can minimize the terminal window now. What I want to do is I first want to get my imports. So I'm going to import both the scan and query command. Okay, from the AWS client-dynamodb library. I'm going to import the DynamoDB client. Okay, that's the database client. And then lastly, I'm going to import one more thing, which is I want to be able to unmarshal data. So we'll talk about marshaling and unmarshaling here in a second, but I'm going to want to unmarshal data, and that's in the utils-dynamodb library. Okay, so first thing I want to do is I want to create an instance of the DynamoDB client. Okay, so I have this variable const client equal to a new DynamoDB client. You can see one of the parameters that I can pass is the region. But since I'm working on my local machine, I don't want that. I actually want to set the endpoint pointing at my local machine, which is going to be that HTTP localhost :8000. Same address as what you've seen from the AWS CLI. Okay, then I'm going to have to set up some parameters to run my scan. And specifically, if you remember back from the CLI videos, if I was going to do a scan, I had to specify the endpoint URL, and then I also had to pass in what was the table name that I was actually scanning. So I'm going to have a variable for my params equal to some JSON object where my table name is equal to baseball stats. Okay. So those are the parameters that I need for the scan. And then once I've done that, then I'm going to get my data back. So here's my data equal to this client that I can send the new scan command with my parameters. And since it's asynchronous, I have to await this data. Okay, and then once I've done that, the data is going to come back, and let's just go ahead and do a console.log of the data. Okay, and they're trying to map through the data, but I'm just going to log the data, and we should be able to see this down in the terminal window. So I'm just going to go ahead and come down to the terminal window. I'll clear the screen, and then I want to run this file. I have to save the file. I'm going to go ahead and run the file by saying node and then index.mjs. And you'll see that we get this data, but it's not real easily accessible because the data at each attribute is actually an object. And the object tells us what's the data type and the corresponding object. Okay, what I want to do is I actually want to see the data. So I want to see the player name, I want to see the position, I want to see the team ID, and right now I can't do that because they're all objects. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that data, I'm going to map over all the items in the data, and then I'm going to unmarshal them, which is basically to say unmarshal means I want to unwrap the actual data from the fact that there's a data type associated with it. So instead of having an object for the team ID, I'm just going to have the raw data, which is that string that indicates what the team ID is. Okay, so I'm going to map over that. Okay, so now if I come down to the terminal, I clear again, and I run this. Now I'm looking at this unmarshaled data, and you'll notice that each of the individual attributes is no longer an object. It no longer has that indicator saying, hey, the data type is actually a string. And you might think that that's problematic, but you'll see how the unmarshalling actually happens if I can find a numeric value. I think I'll find numeric values in the games. So you'll notice in the games, the sort key indicates the date. I have two different teams, but then you'll notice the opposing team runs and runs are both numeric. They're not quoted. Okay, so that unmarshalling process actually figures out the fact that, hey, these are numeric data pieces. They don't need to be in quotes. They shouldn't be treated as strings. So that's what the unmarshalling process will do. Similarly, I could take that same data and marshal it back up. Okay, so if I wanted to return to form, I could marshal the data. That is an option. Okay, so I'm just going to rename this file. I'm going to name it scan.mjs. Okay, so if we clear this now, instead of running node index.mjs, I'd run that scan, and we'll see that DynamoDB scan command. I want to create another file, and this is going to be my query.mjs. Okay, so I want to run a query. I want to bring in the same imports. I want to create that client. So all of this stuff I want to bring over. It's going to be exactly the same. My parameters are going to be a little bit different. My parameters, remember, I have to supply a key condition expression. Okay, and in this case, I'm going to use team ID equal to T. I'll use team ID. And then the expression attribute values. So you'll notice that it automatically filled in. And some of you might be wondering, how is that automatically filling in? I'm using GitHub Copilot is how that's coming through. So it's expecting me to fill in a value for the team ID. So for this case, let's go ahead and use player info _ LAA to look at all the players that belong to the Angels. Okay, and then once I've done that, those are the things that I need to supply. So I'm specifying the endpoint URL, the table name, the key condition expression, the expression attribute values, and now I can go ahead and get data by sending a query command, and I can log that data. Okay, and same thing where I'm mapping over each item that came back and I'm unmarshalling that data set. So if I clear this and I run query.mjs, okay, you'll notice that I'm getting my 4 Angels players. Okay, so this is really just meant to be kind of a quick introduction about how do we translate those AWS CLI commands that we've worked on in terms of accessing DynamoDB. How do we bring those commands over from the AWS CLI to our code, okay, to JavaScript code? And then once we have that data in JavaScript code, we can work with the data any way we want. But what I really wanted to show you and really illustrate is that those same parameters that we used from the AWS CLI, so when we're doing a query, we supply what's our endpoint URL, what's the table name, what's the key condition expression, what's the expression attribute values. Those same concepts apply here in code. It's the exact same parameters. Okay, so you work with them the exact same way. So all of that stuff translates over to our code now. Okay, and eventually what we're going to do is we're going to take our code from a local instance of Node.js and we're going to move it out into the cloud in what a product called AWS Lambda. Okay, so really this is just kind of a light introduction into Node.js and specifically being able to scan and query our data in DynamoDB.